Imagine sitting in a basement laboratory at Yale University in July 1961.
You are seated in front of an impressive control panel with 30 toggle switches. The voltage labels range from 15 volts all the way up to a lethal 450 volts, marked clearly with the words danger, severe shock. A stern man in a gray technician coat calmly gives you an order, please continue.
The experiment requires that you continue.
You hear desperate screams from the adjacent room. The victim begs to be let out, screaming that his heart is starting to bother him. Yet, 65% of participants, ordinary citizens, teachers, accountants, postal workers, and engineers, turned the dial all the way to maximum voltage. They genuinely believe they were electrocuting an innocent human being simply because an authority figure told them to. How far would you go if someone in power told you to inflict suffering on a stranger? Today, we explore Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiment, a terrifying window into the darker side of the human psyche. To understand why this study happened, we have to look back at the immediate aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust. In April 1961, the world watched the televised trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the major architects of the Nazi final solution. Eichmann had been captured in Argentina by Israeli intelligence agents and brought to trial in Jerusalem. His defense was simple and repeated endlessly throughout his testimony, "I was only following orders." This line of defense raised a profound and disturbing question for social scientists across the globe. Were Nazi perpetrators uniquely evil monsters, or could anyone commit terrible atrocities under the right situational pressure? Stanley Milgram, a 33-year-old assistant professor of psychology at Yale University, set out to test this exact question. Born in the Bronx to Jewish immigrant parents, Milgram was deeply haunted by the Holocaust. He rejected the popular idea that the German public possessed a unique cultural character flaw that made them abnormally obedient. Instead, Milgram hypothesized that social structures and authority pressure could drive almost anyone to act against their personal moral conscience. In July 1961, just days after Eichmann's trial began in Jerusalem, Milgram placed classified advertisements in local newspapers across New Haven, Connecticut. The advertisements called for men aged 20 to 50 from all walks of life, barbers, clerks, salesmen, and blue-collar laborers, to participate in a paid study on memory and learning at Yale University. Participants were offered $4 for 1 hour of work, which is roughly equivalent to $40 today.
When participants arrived at Linsly-Chittenden Hall on Yale's campus, they met two men.
One was the experimenter, played by John Williams, a local high school biology teacher who wore a stern, impassive gray lab coat. The other was a fellow participant, or so the subject believed. This second man was actually an accomplice, a 47-year-old accountant named James Wallace, who was mild-mannered and friendly. The real participant and Mr. Wallace drew slips of paper from a hat to assign their roles, teacher or learner. The draw was secretly rigged so that the volunteer subject always became the teacher and the accomplice always became the learner. The teacher then watched as the learner was led into an adjacent room, seated in a chair, and strapped down at the wrists with leather restraints. An electrode was attached to Mr. Wallace's wrist, and electrode paste was applied to prevent chemical burns. To heighten the stakes, Mr. Wallace mentioned offhandedly that he had a mild heart condition. The experimenter responded in a flat tone that while the shocks might be extremely painful, they would cause no permanent tissue damage. The teacher was then escorted back to the main room and seated in front of a formidable shock generator. The panel featured 30 lever switches labeled in 15-volt increments, starting from 15 volts, marked slight shock, up to 450 volts, marked with a ominous XXX. The teacher's task was to read pairs of words over an intercom system and then test the learner's memory. Every time Mr. Wallace gave an incorrect answer, the teacher was ordered to flip a switch and deliver an electric shock, increasing the voltage by 15 volts for every single error. In reality, the shock generator was fake. Mr. Wallace received no actual electricity. But the participant had no idea. To make the setup completely believable, the participant was given a real 45-volt sample shock at the very beginning of the session. As the voltage escalated, pre-recorded audio responses were played through the wall. At 75 volts, Mr. Wallace grunted in discomfort. At 120 volts, he shouted that the shocks were becoming painful. At 150 volts, he cried out, insisting he wanted to be let out of the study and complaining about his heart condition. At 270 volts, his responses turned into agonizing, breathless screams. At 300 volts, he refused to answer any more questions.
Past 330 volts, complete and heavy silence fell from the room next door.
Whenever participants hesitated or turned to the experimenter for guidance, John Williams delivered 4 strictly scripted prods in sequential order.
First, please continue, or please go on. Second, the experiment requires that you continue. Third, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And fourth, you have no other choice, you must go on. If the participants still refused after the 4th prod, the experiment was terminated. The results stunned Milgram and shocked the scientific community. Before conducting the study, Milgram surveyed 40 psychiatrists, who predicted that less than 1% of participants would go all the way to 450 volts. They assumed only clinical psychopaths would administer maximum voltage. But in the baseline variation, 26 out of 40 participants, a staggering 65%, administered the full 450-volt shock, despite hearing the learner scream in pain and then go completely unresponsive. Between 1961 and 1962, Milgram carried out 18 distinct variations of the study, testing nearly 1,000 individuals to isolate the exact factors that drive human obedience. The results were revealing. When the learner was placed in the same room as the teacher, obedience dropped from 65% down to 40%. When the teacher was forced to physically hold the learner's hand down onto a metal shock plate, obedience fell to 30%. When the experimenter gave orders over the phone instead of standing in the room, obedience plummeted to 21%, with many participants actively lying to the experimenter over the phone while skipping switch levels. To explain these findings, Milgram proposed 2 primary psychological concepts. First was the agentic state theory. Milgram argued that when individuals enter a hierarchical system, they often stop viewing themselves as autonomous agents responsible for their own actions. Instead, they shift into an agentic state, viewing themselves merely as an instrument executing the commands of a higher authority. In this state, personal conscience is effectively muted. The second concept was conformity theory, where individuals in uncertain situations defer to the authority or group to define reality. However, Milgram's experiment has faced massive criticism over the years. Ethically, critics like psychologist Diana Baumrind condemned Milgram for subjecting participants to severe psychological trauma without genuine informed consent or immediate emotional support. Many participants were seen weeping, trembling, digging their fingernails into their flesh, and suffering from fits of nervous laughter. In recent years, archival researchers like Gina Perry examined Milgram's original recordings and unpublished files at Yale. Perry discovered that the experimenter often went wildly off script, pressuring subjects up to 20 times rather than stopping at 4 prods. Furthermore, Perry found evidence that many participants suspected the shocks were fake, raising valid questions about whether subjects were truly obeying authority or simply playing along with a perceived theatrical performance. Despite these methodological concerns and valid ethical debates, the overarching takeaway of Milgram's research remains deeply relevant today. Modern replication studies conducted around the globe, including a notable 2009 study by psychologist Jerry Berger, have consistently replicated similar compliance rates when authority structures are introduced. The Milgram experiment permanently shattered the comforting delusion that evil is committed only by a rare group of monsters. It demonstrated that ordinary, everyday people can be manipulated into becoming tools of destruction when placed inside an authoritative system that demands compliance. Understanding this psychological vulnerability is crucial for preserving freedom and morality in modern society. It serves as a permanent warning against blind deference to authority, whether in government, corporate culture, or scientific institutions. The ultimate lesson of Yale's basement laboratory is that individual moral responsibility can never be surrendered to an authority figure, no matter what title or uniform they wear. What would you have done if you were sitting in that chair? Would you have walked out, or flipped the final switch? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video documentary, please hit the like button, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into psychology and history.